My name is Suzanne Abul Hawa. I'm a novelist and I'm a member of USACB, the US Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel campaign. And I'm a member of Workers' World Party. And I'm also co-chair of this festival together with Bill.
My name is Bill Mullen, and I'm happy to be here today and saying greetings to all of you around the world. I'm also a member of the USACB Organizing Collective and a member of the Palestine BDS Solidarity Working Group of the Democratic Socialists of America. And welcome to you all.
So I'm going to just, while everybody's filing in, I'm going to start with just a little bit of housekeeping. Please, if you are posting to social media, please use the hashtag Palestine Writes. We have interpretation in Arabic. To access that, just click on the globe at the bottom that says interpretation. You should have an option for English or Arabic. And the original speech should go down. You can mute that if you want, if it's too loud. This session will be streaming on Facebook and other social media venues. I'd like to start by acknowledging our interpreters. Rawan and Arsen are in the background. We also have Daoud Ghannam, who is doing the tech work for this team. We're going to start this evening's panel, or I guess it's morning for some people and afternoon for others, but to our family members back home overseas and in Palestine especially, it's evening. We're going to start with a letter from Khalida Jarrar, our political prisoner and revolutionary leader. It's going to be read by her daughters Yafa and Suha. Yafa is a Palestinian human rights lawyer currently living in Ottawa. She's been involved in BDS in Palestine and internationally since 2005. Suha Jarrar is a senior research and advocacy officer with Al-Haq Human Rights Organization, and particularly in the areas of gender, environment, and climate justice within the context of occupation.
And before we turn to Yafa and Suha's reading, we wanted to introduce them via another really important Palestinian figure we've been talking about this weekend. We have what we like to think of as a special message, a short video from the great Ghassan Kanafani, which we'd like to share with you before we move on to the program.
These people, the Palestinian people, prefer to die standing than to lose its case. We achieved proving that this nation is going to continue fighting till victory. We achieved that our people could never be defeated. We achieved teaching every single person in this world that we are a small, brave nation who are going to fight to the last drop of blood to put justice for ourselves after the world failed in giving it to us. To us, to liberate our country, to have dignity, to have respect, to have our mere human rights is something as essential as life itself. Of the Palestinian people who are uprooted, thrown in the camps, living in starvation, killed for 20 years, and forbidden to use even the name Palestinians. One thing that we have a case to fight for. That's very much.
So I hope that sets the tone for this keynote session. Ghassan Kanafani, as you all know, was a leading Palestinian literary figure as well as a revolutionary. So we're going to start by introducing our panelists now. None of them need an introduction, of course, and in fact, going through their bios adequately would probably take up most of this hour. If we were to itemize all of their accomplishments and everything that they have done for us. So we're going to keep those brief. I'm going to start with Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. She is a Palestinian leader, legislator, author, activist, and scholar who has been intimately involved in the Palestinian struggle since she was a young girl. She was an important part of the Madrid peace talks, which, if they had not been thwarted by the secret Oslo Agreement, would have meant a very different fate for Palestine than what we find ourselves in now. And I want to say something personal about Hanan. She is a big part of the reason that I became a writer. In the second Intifada, I wrote a few things here and there, but mostly I worked as a scientist for a drug company. And I got an email from her one day. She had read an essay that I'd written and took the time to look me up and send me a letter encouraging me to consider writing. And I've always thought of that because I think it speaks to the kind of person and the kind of leader that she is. No one had heard of me at the time, and but she recognized a potential in another woman, and very quietly and privately did what she could to enable that potential. And it is a great honor for me to moderate this panel with her today.
And it's my honor and pleasure to introduce you to Richard Falk. I think someone that many people here know very well. Richard is a professor emeritus of international law and practice at Princeton University, and he's the former United Nations Human Rights Rapporteur in the Palestinian occupied territories, as well as a member of the Nation editorial board. He has written many, many books, all of which I recommend, including Chaos and Counter-Revolution After the Arab Spring, and very relevant to our discussion today, in 2014, Palestine, the Legitimacy of Hope. Beyond being a scholar of great renown, I think Richard is known as a role model for many of us on the left who've been doing Palestine solidarity work for such a long time, as well as being an incredibly principled critic of US imperialism and Israeli settler colonialism, a brilliant advocate for the rights of the world's oppressed from Vietnam to South Africa, and a fearless advocate for Palestinian self-determination. History, he once wrote, is on the side of the Palestinians. And for many of us today, and people who do the work that I try to do, Richard's an inspiration for his lifelong political commitment to social justice.
And finally, Dr. Angela Davis, who likewise needs her introduction. She is an iconic American revolutionary, scholar, and author. She emerged as a leading activist in the 1960s in the Communist Party, and decades later, with many generations of activists standing on her sturdy shoulders, she continues to be a leading and uncompromising internationalist voice for universal dignity, prison abolition, climate protection, and is generally at the heart of radical thought and movement organizing here and abroad. Angela Davis has been a tremendous inspiration in my own life, as she has for millions of us. She's an enemy of the state. The state literally tried to kill her. She never wavered, she never stood down, and extraordinarily, the gravitational field of her dignity and her resolve has always inspired a kind of force field of solidarity to rally around her, just as she shows up to this day to rally for others. It is my great honor to welcome Dr. Angela Davis. Thank you all for being here. So I'm gonna start with a question for all of the panelists, but I'm gonna start with you, Angela, because you recently took part in a Palestine Writes initiative. And actually, I'm so sorry, we forgot a really important.
Hey, you didn't.
We spelled this out, and we have. I'm going to backtrack a little bit. Of course, this is what happens when you try to plan things. We have a letter for you that's really important. So I'd like to invite Suha and Yafa Jarrar to come on. and read us a letter from their mother. Khalida Jarrar.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good evening. This is a letter from my mother, Palestinian political prisoner Khalida Jarrar, to the Palestine Writes Festival. This letter was translated from Arabic by Jamila Abed. From the Israeli Damoun prison, located at the top of Mount Carmel in Haifa, I extend my greetings to you on behalf of myself and my 40 fellow women Palestinian freedom fighters in Israeli prisons. We extend our salute and due respect is to all writers, scholars, intellectuals, and artists who speak the truth and call for the freedom and justice of all people, and who defend people's right to self-determination and oppose colonial racist domination.
On this occasion, please allow me to also send our greetings and support to all Arab writers, scholars, intellectuals, and artists who reject normalization with Israel's settler colonial system, and who have refused to accept the Emirati, Bahraini, and Sudanese normalization agreements with the Zionist entity. It is stands such as these that represent the true ties between our people in the Arab world and empower us, prisoners, from within. Although physically we are held captive behind fences and bars, our souls remain free and are soaring in the skies of Palestine and the world. Regardless of the severity of the Israeli occupation's practices and imposed punitive measures, our free voice will continue to speak out on behalf of our people who have suffered horrendous catastrophes, displacement, occupation, and arrests. It will also continue to let the world know of the strong Palestinian will that will relentlessly reject the challenge colonialism in all its forms. We work to establish and consolidate human values and strive to obtain social and economic liberation that bind the free people of the world together.
Salute to the participants in this closing panel, Comrade Angela Davis, colleague and friend Hanan Ashrawi, Richard Falk, the beloved Suzanne Abulhawa, and Bill V. Millen. As for our contribution to this conference, we would like to attempt to bring to you our actual experiences with literature and culture while in Israeli prisons. The most important element in this regard is books. Books constitute the foundation of life in prison. They preserve the psychological and moral balance of the freedom fighters who view their detention as part of the overall resistance against the colonial occupation of Palestine. Books also play a role in each prisoner's individual struggle of will between them and the prison's authorities. In other words, the struggle becomes a challenge for Palestinian prisoners as the jailers seek to strip us from our humanity and keep us isolated from the outside world. The challenge for prisoners is to transform our detention into a state of a cultural revolution through reading, education, and literary discussions.
Palestinian political prisoners face many obstacles in accessing books. For example, books do not reach us at times as they undergo tight control mechanisms and confiscations when brought by a family member. In theory, each woman prisoner is allowed to receive 2 books per month. However, these books are subject to scrutiny checks, where more often than not, they are rejected by the prison administration under the pretext of being incitement books. Depriving prisoners access to books is used as a punishment where prisoners are banned from receiving books for 2 or 3 months, as I myself experienced in 2017. The modest library used by the prisoners is also subject to constant inspections in order for prison guards to confiscate any book that may have been brought in without their knowledge. This prompts prisoners to come up with creative means to protect books that are likely to be seized. Preventing books from being captured by prison authorities constitutes one of the most important tasks for prisoners.
With this in mind, Palestinian women prisoners succeeded in sneaking in a number of great books despite the strict constrictions. For example, in addition to some philosophy and history books, many of Ghassan Kanafani's books, Ibrahim Nasrallah and Suzanne Abul Hawa's work, were amongst those that were successfully accessed and studied by prisoners. Maxim Gorky's novel, The Mother, became a comfort to women prisoners who are deprived from their mother's love. The works of Domitila Chungara, Abdurrahman Munif, Al-Tahir Wattar, Ahlam Mustaghanmi, Mahmoud Darwish, Elif Shafak's The 40 Rules of Love, Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, Nawal Saadawi, Sahar Khalifa, Edward Said, Angela Davis, and Albert Camus' books, all are among the most enjoyed books that dodged inspections and were successfully smuggled. However, books such as Notes from the Gallows by Julius Fuchik and Antonio Gramsci's Prison Notebooks were never able to escape the jailer's measures and restrictions. As a matter of fact, none of Gramsci's books were allowed into prisons due to what seems to be a very hostile stance by the occupation authorities towards Gramsci.
On the brighter side of our lives, some books written by prisoners inside prisons were able to sneak their way through to us. One of which speaks about the imprisonment and interrogation experiences in Israeli prisons, entitled, You Are Not Alone. What I'm trying to say, my dear artists and writers, is that your books that are displayed in bookstores worldwide are subject to pursuit and confiscation by Israel's occupation prison authorities if we attempt to access them. Your books here are arrested like our people are. Access to books is not the only struggle facing Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons. I will attempt to give you a sneak view of our lives. Keep in mind, however, that our will requires of us to remain strong as steel.
Israeli prison authorities impose oppressive measures on a daily basis, demonstrated by applying isolation policies through solitary confinement. They also deprive us of family visits, prevent entry of cultural and literary books, and completely ban educational books. They also ban singing in all its forms. Revolutionary and regular songs are banned.
Furthermore, we are not allowed to buy more than the one radio we have access to. The radio is an important source of information that connects us to the outside world by delivering the world news. But the radio is more than that to us. It is a tool that connects us with our families and friends as they call in and send messages through the various Palestinian radio programs. Israeli prison authorities also do not allow any type of assembly or gathering. They continuously punish women prisoners through reducing items that can be purchased from the canteen, the only store available.
Prisoners are continuously monitored through scrutiny of surveillance cameras that surround every corner of the prison, including Al-Fora Square. This square is where women prisoners are allowed to feel the sun for 5 intermittent hours each day outside their locked rooms and steel windows. Our rooms are also subject to rigorous and provocative inspections at all hours of the night or day in search of any piece of paper with writing on it. You can imagine how difficult it was for me to get this note out to you.
All of the above and more forces us to devise various methods to thwart these policies. Some details and items may seem trivial outside prison, but hold great importance for us women prisoners inside. For example, the pen is important, the paper is important, and books are considered a treasure, all of which constitute tools used as part of our survival and struggle against the occupation, and also to develop ourselves.
On a happier note, we find that many prisoners, despite struggles mentioned, especially those with high sentences, have enriched literature by publishing novels, which I hope will earn the attention of Arab and international writers. In addition, the prisoners' movement has published a number of studies and researches that shed light on the reality of conditions in Israeli prisons. I myself have conducted a study in 2016 while in prison on the state of women prisoners in Israeli prisons. The study focused on the effects and violations against Palestinian women and children prisoners inside prisons. In 2019, I prepared another paper on education inside Israeli prisons, which was published in Ramzi Baroud's book on education and women prisoners entitled "These Chains Will Be Broken."
Unfortunately, I have not seen the published version of the book due to my current rearrest. In the mentioned paper, I presented the challenges education faces in prison, one of which being Israel's persistence in preventing us to carry out any educational process in prison. Their aim is clearly to isolate prisoners, both men and women, and to break us by transforming us into individuals with no hopes or plans for a decent future. Prisoners, on the other hand, give their utmost to thwart attempts of the prison authorities through innovating creative methods to gain the right to education.
We are now seeking to start university education for the first round of women prisoners as a second stage of our struggle to claim the right to education. This will mark the first time in history where Palestinian women prisoners, especially those with high sentences, are able to earn a university degree while in prison. In the near future, an update will be available on this subject, including challenges faced.
Part of the university educational program is based on integrating Palestinian, Arab, and international educational experiences through resistance literature. The program will also include research and scientific studies available to us in prison in an attempt to deepen women prisoners' analytical capabilities and to identify their ambition for their future.
The whole initiative aims to inspire and strengthen women's prisoners' self-confidence by encouraging them to consider the prison a place for creative, cultural, and human growth. We hope that the initiative will strengthen women's prisoners' convictions and abilities to create change in society once we are liberated.
This initiative aims at contributing to the overall liberation struggle against Israeli apartheid and gender inequality by empowering women prisoners to further their education and enter the workforce when they are freed. I want to note that during my preparation of this statement, we held 2 educational sessions for women prisoners who registered for university education. The 2 sessions were on English and Arabic languages, respectively.
What caught my attention was that during the first session on the English language, I requested that each prisoner fill out a mock university application and to identify the field of study they wish to pursue. I would like to share some of the applications that I received.
Shuruq, a prisoner from Jerusalem who is sentenced to 16 years and has served 6 of those years thus far. She was arrested while attending Beit Lahem University with a major in tourism. Shuruq's dream is to become a tour guide. She chose her major in tourism because she wants to educate the world about historical places in Palestine. She is particularly interested in guiding tours in Jerusalem due to the continuing annexation, theft, violations, and distortion of the landscape imposed on the city by the Israeli occupation.
Maysoon, a prisoner from Beit Lahem who's sentenced to 15 years in prison and has served 6 of those years thus far. She was arrested while attending university with a major in literature. Maysoon is an avid reader, even in prison. She loves literature. She portrays literature as a method to form one's future. Literature, in her opinion, requires the reader to think and answer many questions concerning a particular topic raised by the novel or literary work at hand. She believes this leads to critical thought and cultural growth.
Ruba. Ruba is a third-year sociology student attending Birzeit University. She was arrested 3 months ago and is still in detention. Ruba has the desire and readiness to continue her studies upon her release. According to Ruba, the reason for choosing sociology as a major is to develop her academic knowledge and analysis of social and class structures in society and their impacts on women.
In my attempt to understand the motives behind these women's aspirations and dreams, I decided to discuss the issues in more depth with the women themselves. I found the common denominator amongst them to be rebellion. Rebellion against oppression and imposed restrictions. A definite rejection of the occupation policies in preventing education for women prisoners. An inner force to challenge the control used against women prisoners, aiming to isolate and transform them into desperate women who have no dreams or plans for the future.
Other motives include resistance against the occupation's plan to erase Palestinian identity and history. These women also want to break away from stereotypical and gendered professions that society designates for women. That is why they chose majors such as tourism, literature, sociology, and critical theory.
As for the second session on the Arabic language, we focused on autobiographies and worked on the different methods for drafting autobiographies. Women prisoners were divided into groups that discussed various biographies, including that of the Bolivian labor leader and feminist, Domitila Chungara, Let Me Speak, which speaks about the miners' experience and struggles in Bolivia. In addition, we studied biographies and autobiographies of established Arab writers, such as Taha Hussein's Al-Ayyam and Murid Barghouti's I Was Born There, I Was Born Here.
The session also included analysis of literary texts such as Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish's entitled Uncertainty of the Returned, which was a speech delivered by Darwish at Birzeit University at a celebration of the liberation of southern Lebanon in 2000. The education sessions, presentations, and discussions enriched women prisoners' knowledge and encouraged them to continue reading books and novels. We are turning the prison into a cultural school where prisoners learn about their experiences and where we spoil the occupation's attempts to isolate us from the rest of the world.
In conclusion, our struggle for liberation inside prisons starts with protecting resistance literature. We are conveying our voices and stories as we write them under very difficult circumstances. When we are caught, the price we pay is heavy at times, especially when our punishment is solitary confinement or banning of family visitations.
A case in point is the price paid by the prisoner Walid Daqqa, who was placed in solitary confinement for smuggling his novel outside of prison to be published. This constitutes another challenge we face in the framework of the two wills, the will of the freedom fighters and that of the colonizers, as expressed by the freedom fighter Domitila Chungara, Let Me Speak.
We, the Palestinian women prisoners, also say, let us speak.
Let us speak.
Let us dream.
Let us dream.
Let us be liberated.
Let us be liberated.
Thank you for listening and for giving me the opportunity to participate in this conference. Khalida Jarrar, political prisoner at the Moon Prison. This letter was written on October 17th, 2020. Thank you.
Thank you, Suha and Yafa. It's an honor to have your mother's voice here at this festival. And thank you for her words. And thank you for mentioning the radio station. For those who don't know, there is a Qanat al-Asra in Palestine that's used as a one-way method of communicating. It's the only way right now with prisoners. And recently, through Palestine Writes, Dr. Angela Davis sent a message to our political prisoners. Upwards of 3,000 prisoners huddled around old radios to hear this message. And it was extraordinarily uplifting to their spirits, from what I understand. So I'm going to start with you, Angela, to perhaps to react to this, and then maybe also Hanan and Richard could join in after. Hearing this letter from Khalida, I wonder if you could briefly react to it in the context of, number one, the place of literature in revolutionary imagination, and also the place of prison literature in popular imagination. And I also want to say too that the moment a couple years ago when I heard that my book was smuggled into prison and was read by Palestinian prisoners is easily the proudest moment of my career as a writer. So thank you for that.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this wonderful festival, Palestine Writes. And I was so deeply moved, Yafa and Suha, by your mother's letter. I'm wondering, will we be able to get the text of the letter? It's so powerful and resonates in so many ways. Particularly the role of writing and literature and the imagination. I was just watching a film recently about people in prison in Washington State, where the prisoners themselves created a curriculum and began to teach other prisoners because they were not allowed to take classes. And one of them said, when I'm teaching, I almost feel free. And for me, that resonates with the Palestinian struggle because for as long as I've been supporting justice in Palestine, I've been aware of the centrality of education, of writing, of intellectual work. I think of all of the struggles in the world, the struggle for Palestine has centered the role of literature and education, and in that way is a model for all of us. Wow, there's so many ways in which I could respond, but perhaps I'll simply recall that in the many ways in which the struggle for against the occupation of Palestine has had an impact on the Black struggle in the US, it's important to remember that the first collection of Palestinian religious, Palestinian resistance literature, rather, that was circulated in the US was published by a small Black publishing house. And of course, the title of the anthology was Enemy of the Sun, after the poem by Sama el-Qasim. And I remember how deeply we were all affected by that collection. It became almost absolutely necessary to be aware of this anthology if you were really a Black revolutionary. And more recently, Greg Thomas has done an installation about the fact that the poem that gives the title to the anthology was found in George Jackson's cell after he was assassinated by prison guards there. And for a very long time, the Black Panther Party circulated the poem by Samila Kasim, but under the name of George Jackson, because the assumption was, since it was written out in his writing, that he had written that poem. And to me, that captures the interrelationalities, the interconnections, the closeness, the intimacies of our struggles.
Beautiful.
Hanan or Richard, would you?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you. I don't want to repeat all the statements of gratitude, Susie and Bill and everybody who's worked on making this amazing experience possible. It is really unique and it's quite invigorating and empowering. Thank you very much. And thank you, Suha and Yafa, for reading Khalida's letter, which as always is very moving. The double victimization and injustice is the fact that Khalida keeps getting arrested under the administrative detention laws, which are really remnants, leftovers of the British mandate, so which have been repealed by colonial powers when they withdrew, but which remained in effect and being used by Israel against people, as you know, imprisonment without trial, without evidence, without hearing, without due process anyway. But the whole prison system in Palestine is entirely illegal and unjust because they try civilians in military courts. They imprison people in Israel outside the occupied area. And not only that, there are people who think that there is some justice in Israeli prisons. We do not recognize any legality within the Israeli prison system, because we think it is, as a whole, it is just an extension and an arm of the occupation. And it is another means of oppression, and it is another means of silencing Palestinian resistance of all types. As you know, more than since 67, we don't have the statistics since 48, they're astounding. Israel has arrested between 800,000 to 1 million Palestinians. So you can imagine whole populations and generations going through the prison system and being branded, labeled as terrorists, you know, and being charged guilty by virtue of their identity of being Palestinian, and by virtue of the fact that Israel has full impunity and can do whatever it wants to the Palestinians without any kind of accountability. This is one. In addition, of course, to the 75,000 or close to 80,000 Palestinians who've been killed by Israel. And yet we're supposed to adopt the discourse of Israel and describe them as terrorists and denounce our history of struggle, because Palestinians from the beginning have been not just active, have been engaged in different forms of resistance, every aspect of resistance. And I would say that any expression or any creative output is by definition intrusive and disruptive and provocative, if you will, because true literature, true creativity, true culture, true artistic expression as a whole challenges reality, challenges the status quo. And when people talk about the what they call engaged literature or engaged art, if it is true art, it has to be engaged, it has to be committed, it has to, in different ways, not just accept or acquiesce reality that we cannot call art or literature, but it has to challenge it, it has to create awareness about it, and it has to, in many ways, be an instrument of change, and ultimately to create and provide alternatives. And when you are living in a situation where the legal system is in itself unjust and unfair, when you are living in a situation of oppression, then you have to be an outlaw, because the oppressor's law is not at all acceptable. The oppressor's law is part of the oppression. So that's why you see many great writers are, in general, are outlaws, as we call them, because they challenge the illegal and oppressive and unjust laws that have been put in place in order to maintain the victimization of the victim or the control of the victim, in our case, Palestinians. So every Palestinian, in a sense, is, by the fact of existence, is defying an act of aggression and deprivation and negation by saying we're here and we exist. And because there were historically all these attempts at negating our very presence even, and attempting to carry out ethnic cleansing of Palestine and so on, Palestinians and Palestinian literature and Palestinian cultural output of all forms. I mean, you've had filmmakers, you've had even culinary artists, you've had painters and so on in this conference, in this festival, I'll call it conference. You're celebrating Palestinian collectivity. Every bit of it is an act of resistance, because you are defying attempts at confiscating not just your land, but your voice, your utterance, and distorting your narrative. No, you are affirming your narrative the way you did, Susie. I mean, really, in your latest book, Against the Loveless World, you showed in a very comprehensive way the spirit of defiance and rebellion against many different types of oppression, as a woman, as a Palestinian. And it really touched so many people's hearts and minds, because you've done it in such a way as to bring people face to face with the horrors of what people have to go through. But you also maintain the dialectic of, like all good revolutionary literature, of having the anger, having the angst, having the rage, having the rejection, and so on, all these in one place, but again, with a spirit of love and sensitivity and gentleness. And that's why we say, we Palestinians, because we love our land, because we love our people, that's why we are so agitated and angry. And that's why we rebel. And that's why any true act, any true literary, and I mean the creative impulse in general in Palestine, is one that is simultaneously an act of affirmation. We affirm who we are, we affirm our rights, our humanity, our identity, our history, our culture, and so on, but we also reject. We reject all attempts at subjugation, at silencing, at casting us outside, the human domain. That's why writers like Edward Said and others who have challenged Western imperialism on their own terms have made inroads and have become very uncomfortable voices in the West. It's not just Orientalism or cultural and imperialism. It's the fact of being and not being silenced or intimidated. And that's why people like Khalida, who understand the power of women, yes, we'll be talking about that, the power of books, but the power of a collective sharing of the imagination and of our history. I would just like, may I just give you one quotation? I would like to remind people there were so many wonderful writers and artists and creative people and intellectuals in this festival. But how many of us or of you remember Abdurrahim Mahmoud? Do you know the name? He's the one who, to me, he's the essence of they call him the martyr poet, but I call him the warrior poet, because he was a writer, he was an educator, he died, he was killed at a very young age. He's the one who wrote سأحمل روحي على راحتي وألقي بها في مهاوي الردى فإما حياة تسر الصديق وإما ممات يغيظ العدا. He says, I will cast my life, I will carry my life on my palm and cast it into perdition. For either I have a life, either I live a life that would please my friends, or a death that would enrage my foe. And he went to fight in 1948 and he was killed. He has beautiful poetry, and he is the essence of the warrior poet. But we had a series of warrior poets. You discussed Hassan Kanafani, but there are people like How many people remember when we recite Mawtini, that is Ibrahim Tuqan, who wrote Mawtini with all these wonderful words and so on, and his sister Fadwa, who was one of the most prominent women writers of the time and a good friend of mine. And there were many others, but these were people upon whom we built our literary tradition, whom we incorporated within our own cultural imagination and identity. When we ask your parents, I think you're too young, Susie, if they remember this primer for children in schools called, when we used to study Ras, Rus, Dar, Dur. This was a book for children that was adopted by all schools, written by Khalil Sakakini, a great educator, and of course, intellectual giant in the early 20th century. So those resonate within us. We all are bearing this tradition, literary, cultural, historical. This is the sort of vertical development, but then we can talk about the horizontal sort of reaching out and being reached by others, and solidarity and genuine intersectionality. I will stop here and love to both of you, Suha and Yafa, and give my love to Khalida whenever you can. When you speak on the radio, tell her that her friend and colleague misses her.
Thank you so much, Hanan and Angela. And I'm going to ask Richard also for his thoughts on Khalida's letter. And I want to ask Richard also about a piece of writing that he did that also ended up putting him in an Israeli jail. And I'm talking about the report that you wrote, Richard, when you were serving as special rapporteur to the UN Human Rights Council. I think it was in 2013, and I think in 2014, you published a report in the process of trying to gather information about Palestinian human rights. And you wrote these words, and I want to read from them because I think they're very, very powerful words. You wrote, "The prolonged occupation possesses legally unacceptable characteristics of colonialism, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing. And you were savagely attacked for telling this truth by Zionists. Israel threw you out. You got attacked by the political establishment in the United States, and yet you stood behind your report. And I want to ask you what it was like for you to experience those attacks, but also what can we learn from your experience of standing up, standing strong as an advocate for Palestine and standing behind the truth of a report like that?"
Richard, you're muted. You're muted.
Kind. Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Thank you, Bill, for your kind introduction. And it's a real honor for me to be part of this extraordinary festival, considering what the Palestinian ordeal has been for so long. This show of cultural vitality and spiritual energy is particularly inspiring and comes at a time when so many other negative energies are overwhelming our sensibilities in many ways. So this festival is something very special in the course of the Palestinian struggle, which has long been for me not something so much that I have contributed to, but that I've learned from and been inspired by. And it's been an honor always to have this opportunity to share some of that experience with all of you. It's also a particular honor to be on this panel with persons who've been heroes of mine for a long, long time, for decades, and to have this chance to have this conversation is a wonderful thing in this period of COVID lockdown where we seem so isolated from those that we love and cherish. As far as my own experience as special rapporteur for the UN on the Israeli victimizations of the Palestinian people in the course of the occupation, I really did nothing more than report the reality. And that reality was so stark and unambiguous that you really didn't need to have a strong sense of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. I used to tell people that if you were 10% objective, you would write the same kind of report that I was writing. And that it was I think the reality of Palestinian victimization through this dynamic interplay of colonialism, apartheid, and continuous oppression, that created a sense of some kind of recognition by the Israelis and the US that they had to attack the messenger rather than try to deal with the message. And it represented a shift in their tactics about how to handle a critical discourse. And I think meant that they came into an awareness that they were losing what I call the legitimacy war. That is the struggle to gain the spiritual, moral, and legal high ground in a situation of conflict. And if you look at the history of the last 75 years or so, it isn't the side that has the better weaponry or the battlefield control that prevails politically in these struggles. All the anti-colonial struggles were won by the weaker side militarily. And it's a kind of unlearned lesson by both the Israeli and American political elites. They haven't liberated themselves from the militarization of their own imagination. And that's tied up with the kind of excessive investment in military solutions to political problems and the marginalization of the moral imagination, so that the Israeli experience and the experience of prisons is in a kind of way a metaphor of the whole Palestinian reality. You see it in its more intense form in these conditions that were so movingly described in the letter, but the whole Palestinian reality, or any reality that is characterized accurately as apartheid, is not only an international crime, but it also represents a form of imprisonment, because the reality of apartheid is such that there's no way for the oppressors to keep control except by coercive terror, by state terror, essentially. So that state terror is implicit in this whole dynamic of controlling in different ways, different segments of the Palestinian people. And I've been so impressed over the years by the spiritual resilience that is so often expressed culturally, that has been demonstrated by Palestinians, and I believe is the path to liberation and victory. That, as I say, the record of the last 75 years shows that those that have that kind of spiritual perseverance and enjoy a global resonance in the form of solidarity will prevail. It may be a painful struggle and with many tragedies along the way, but the flow of history is consistently vindicating that commitment to emancipation and liberation. And those of us that are on the sidelines of these struggles realize that it is that we have no reason not to maintain our dedication, because there has been many times when the Palestinians and other oppressed peoples have seemed to be facing a hopeless struggle where things are definitely arrayed against realistic prospects. But somehow that quality of spiritual perseverance has, in the end, overcome the most formidable obstacles. And I feel confident that that is going to happen with regard to the Palestinian people. And I think this festival is a sign of a coming victory.
Thank you, Richard. I really appreciate that wider historic lens on our condition now. I do believe that oppressors persistently underestimate what you call the moral imagination of those they oppress, and I think that has historically always been their downfall. So thank you for bringing that perspective. I want to switch gears slightly to, this question is for both Angela and Hanan, and I'll start with you, Hanan. You were a student at UVA when Angela Davis was facing the death penalty, and you were part of the Black Student Alliance at the time, fighting and rallying for Angela's freedom. And Angela, at the same time, you were already speaking out on behalf of Palestinians. And so now you're on the stage together, and both of you still fighting the good fight. So number one, what does it mean to both of you to be here on stage, having lived parallel lives in a way, still in the same kind of alliance? And what would you say have been the most remarkable changes that you've seen over the span of your struggles? And for the two of you in particular, you've both fought in parallel, not only as internationalists, but as women in largely patriarchal societies. And so maybe speak to your political authority and struggle from a feminist point of view as well.
Do you want me to speak or Angela?
Either.
Angela? I mean, okay. Well, we did lead parallel lives in many ways. I've heard a lot about Angela. We did protest and we did stand in solidarity, as I said, with Angela. When I was a student, we had many organizations that within which I was working. Even though I was the only Palestinian at UVA, we had an Arab Students Association, but we also had American Friends of Free Palestine, and we used to meet regularly with the Virginia Collective, as well as with, and we used to talk and meet with the Appalachian mine workers and with the, what was it, Socialist Workers' Party at that time, the New Left, and the women's movement. It was all a whole era of revolutionary struggle and interconnectivity with each other. All the different struggles were somehow connected. And they were among the people who were oppressed, so to speak, not among the what you call the intellectual elite, because it was much more of a gut feeling. It was much more of a sense of identification and connectivity. So Angela, in the same way as even Jane Fonda came to Virginia also at that time. So, and the anti-Vietnam struggle and protest, as well as the Black Panthers and others. It was just an amazing time, full of energy and invigoration, but also full of challenges and threats, because you weren't safe, I mean, at that point. So to be with Angela now is maybe is closing the circle somehow. Can we say that? Because she did stand up as the woman of courage, of principle, who faced real danger, who defied a male and a racist system that attempted to silence her, to threaten her. And she prevailed. And for a woman to prevail in this context and to pursue this and to persist was something not just astounding, but it was really a source of hope for many women. They can do this. I can do this. You can do. We all can do this as women and as people who belong to an oppressed group, because oppression knows no boundaries in many ways. There are different expressions of oppression, but it's the same. We all feel it in the same way, and therefore our identification with each other is a call to struggle, to resist, to reinforce each other. This is the true nature of solidarity. I always say it's not theoretical, it's not abstract, it's active. And unless it's active, it's meaningless. Solidarity has to be active, like Richard. He paid a heavy price for his solidarity. We have a double relationship again, because you were persecuted for standing in solidarity with Palestine, for defending them, for speaking out on our behalf. And then when you were refused entry and when you were expelled and so on, we stood up in solidarity and we protested for you. So this was a mutual sort of defense. When you join forces with the oppressed, you get the same treatment. That's why we keep saying those who go to prison, or those who, even many Israelis who get treated, mistreated by the Israeli authorities, we call them, you get the Palestinian treatment now. So this time, but to go back to the women, I think Palestinian women as a whole, we can talk historically about the Palestinian women's struggle dating back to the 1890s, to the 19th century and so on, and the struggle against the Ottoman Empire, the struggle against the British Mandate and so on. But there was a women's movement in the 20s that was in many ways feminist and that demanded rights and equality that has not been studied enough. I think it's very important to study the early 20th century movement and the women's movement, and to see how they were able to do the double struggle within, as you said, a patriarchal, male-dominated society that is not very kind to women, to put it mildly, and yet they mobilized and demonstrated and so on against the British mandate and colonialism. And then they also had to struggle in every possible way. I'm not going to go through the history of women's struggle, but because they had social injustice, political injustice, and at the same time they suffered all the national injustices that Palestinian society suffered, and they had to take upon themselves responsibilities that other women do not have in many cases. So But I must say that there has been a long history, and at the same time with ups and downs. But I just want to use my experience. You asked me about it before, Susie. Why did I join the PLO? And I said, I had not intended to join the PLO at all. But there was a meeting of the PNC, the Palestine National Council, in order to fill the slots of the executive committee. And as usual, all the men met, and all the factional leaders who were all men met, and they came up with the names to replace the Palestinians who had died, 6, I think, and who were, and there was a vacancy in the executive committee. And all the names they came up with were men, and all independents were men. So the women's movement and the General Union of Palestinian Women came to me and said, we want you to run. We want to insist on having elections, and we want you to run on our behalf, regardless of the political affiliation. So this was an invitation I couldn't refuse. I had never wanted to be a member of the executive committee. I had much rather work within civil society and be a troublemaker, as always. I've always described myself as a troublemaker. It's very hard for me to be within the confines of, political correctness and so on. But so I ran. They forced the women, mutinied. They defied their own parties and factions, and they all voted for me. Otherwise, I wouldn't have won. And that's how I said the women, Palestinian women, debunked the myth that women do not vote for other women. When there is solidarity, when you know that you can win with each other, and through this type of collectivity, then you can make a difference. This is, I don't call it solidarity. Again, I call it, and sisterhood is an old-fashioned term, but I still love it. I think this is a sense of real identification with a joint struggle that goes beyond just factional political party or even power politics. And that's how we get women in places, by supporting them, by intervening, by intruding, by challenging. And Richard, may I borrow yours? I really loved your expression, the marginalization of the moral imagination. This is beautiful. This is really something that has been attempted in many ways for everybody, not just the Palestinians, but anybody who stands in solidarity with us, anybody who dares to speak out, anybody who recognizes the intersectional relationship between the cause of Palestine and the cause of justice and freedom everywhere in the world. And the moral imagination is a powerful force, just as you have the cultural output and cultural imagination as being also a challenging and provocative force.
Angela, would you like to respond to that?
Wow. Thank you so much, Hanan. And let me just say again, it's so inspiring to be in conversation with you and with Richard, because I followed both of you for many, many, many years, and I've been emboldened in my own struggle by your writings and your actions. But I thought that I would mention the fact that when I was in jail, since you evoked that period, one of the most important moments of that period was when I received a solidarity letter from Palestinian political prisoners. This was in 1970, and as I listen to the letter by Khalida Jarrar, I remembered that I had received this letter, which was smuggled out of an Israeli prison and basically smuggled into my cell. I'll never forget how connected that made me feel, not only with Palestine, but with the world, the sense of internationalism that we've been talking about. And you know, my entire trajectory as a political activist has been deeply influenced by the struggle for a free Palestine. I really can't remember when I was not in support of justice for Palestine. So this is something that has constituted my foundation. And I think it might be important to point out that so many important Black figures in the US Black literary tradition have also spoken out on behalf of freedom for Palestine. And I was thinking about Toni Morrison, who was one of my closest friends, and the fact that when she died a year and a half ago, there were some publications, some periodicals, Zionist associated periodicals, who listed her achievements, but then included a however. However, she also signed a letter challenging the efforts of Israel to liquidate Palestine. And you know, I was thinking of my friend June Jordan, who wrote that wonderful poem in which she says, "I was born a Black woman, and now I am become Palestinian against the relentless laughter of evil." I think that our struggle over the last period, you ask about the differences between, I guess, 50 years ago and now, has been precisely to reincorporate the Palestinian struggle, as you point out, Hanan, into our intersectional notion of social justice. It seems to me that as the work of imperialists and Zionists, the US, the state of Israel, has attempted to carve out the Palestinian struggle as one that is not worthy of inclusion in our quest for freedom for this planet. And over the last years or so, many of us have worked against that. And I'm actually quite proud to say that despite, you know, all of the continued repression, there have been victories. I myself received a Human Rights Prize 2 years ago, I think, from the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And then I was informed that they were taking back the prize because of my work around the issue of Palestine. And that actually was an important moment because it demonstrated that people would not capitulate to the assumption that anyone who works on behalf of the freedom for Palestine is to be marginalized. And I was so impressed by the fact that basically the entire Black community in Birmingham stood up and said no. And as a result of that controversy, now the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute has undergone, has had meetings and has come up with a plan that demonstrates that they do truly believe in social justice. So I think that there have been some changes over time, although as Richard has pointed out, I also love that term, the marginalization of the moral imagination. that this is something that we have to continue to challenge.
If I may, I'd like to come back to Dr. Davis with a question, which I think is on a related subject, and it actually has to do with another letter that you received when you were in prison, and it was from James Baldwin. And James, we had a conversation at this festival a couple of days ago about the life and career of James Baldwin and Ghassan Kanafani. And Baldwin was himself a great advocate for Palestinian freedom, especially in the later stages of his life. And I wanted to ask you about the letter he wrote to you. You were a political prisoner at the time. And he says in the letter, Baldwin was, to me, very interesting. Like you, he was a defender of Palestinians. He was a fierce critic of Zionism, and he was a fierce critic of anti-Semitism. And in the letter, he compared you, while you were incarcerated, to a Jewish housewife in the boxcar headed for Dachau, and said that it was up to us, people of conscience, to, quote, render impassable with our bodies the corridor to the gas chamber. I just want to ask you two questions about this letter. What did it mean to you, this letter, to receive it? And how do people like you maintain a balance of all of these solidarities that we have to hold in our minds and in our hearts in order to be real advocates for justice, as you are?
Well, you know, I had met James Baldwin a few years before I was arrested, maybe 2 years before I was arrested. You know, I was an activist with Los Angeles SNCC, and of course no one knew my name. And I was charged with asking him whether or not he would participate in a benefit to raise funds for our organization. And I'll never forget when I went up to him at an event and asked him if he would do this benefit. He said, "Why, certainly, my darling." And then of course he came to visit me. He was in exile, but one of the most important participants in and contributors to the struggle for Black liberation. So that letter was important to me, not only for its beauty and not only for the ways in which she was able to use history as a way to call upon people to stand with me. But it also was you might say, the vanguard of a whole movement of solidarity that took place all over the world. Of course, at that time, we have to remember that communist parties exist. We had a structure of internationalism. But James Baldwin's letter spoke especially to literary figures and intellectuals all over the world, and was in large part responsible for the fact that they supported me and basically saved my life. So yeah, I always think fondly of James Baldwin, and of course his support for Palestine. I was talking, well, before the program started, Hanan was talking about Jean Genet, and the fact that he was a passionate supporter of Palestine. And I have amazing memories of Jean Genet traveling to the US to support the Black Panther Party, crossing over the Canadian border because he would not be able to get a visa, coming in illegally. And I had the opportunity at that time to serve as his translator. It seems to me that those artists who think most deeply and who can capture the collective imagination of people everywhere have never failed to stand up in support of justice for Palestine. So thank you for including that panel.
Thank you for that, Angela. I mean, having this through all of you, this link to these literary giants that have shaped so many of us as writers. As a matter of fact, Angela, the title of my most recent novel, Against the Loveless World, comes directly from a James Baldwin quote in Fire Next Time, a letter to his nephew. I want to loop you in, Richard. Just like all three of you don't seem to have slowed down a single bit in your activism over the decades, which is so inspiring for all of us. Your endurance against, this, what's kind of this exhausting and shape-shifting durability of exploitive capitalism and colonialism is just inspiring. Richard, your activism extends to the anti-Vietnam War, to the Iran hostage situation, and so much more. So I'd like to direct that same question to you regarding the most remarkable changes that you've seen over time in the struggle, not only for Palestine, but for universal human dignity.
Well, it's difficult to give a really helpful response because that's a very probing kind of question. I was brought into the domain of struggling for justice really by my experience in Vietnam, which led me to see the war from the perspective of the victim and to feel that my own identity was not defined by either the fact that I was Jewish or that I was an American, but that I was human. And that seemed to me to be a starting point, which then was mobilized, in my case, partly through my friendship with Edward Said, who used to tease me for being so active in all these other domains, but not being engaged with the Palestinian issue. And it was true that I felt that the atmosphere in the United States was such that touching the Palestinian issue was touching the third rail of American politics, and that it would make me less effective in other ways. But happily, I didn't take that as the stopping point, but rather each step that I took in the direction of engagement with this struggle made me feel that it was a valuable part of my own maturing as a person and as a what I call citizen pilgrim, a person seeking a better future for humanity. And as I said earlier, through my involvement with the Palestinian issue, I have been attacked, as Bill graphically depicted in introducing me, but I've also received love and praise that I didn't deserve. I mean, the attacks were, at least in my sense, undeserved, but also I didn't do any, compared to Angela or Hanan, my role was very trivial. I mean, as a person that just tried to be a witness to the truth and tried to do what I would call advocacy scholarship, to use the intellectual platform that I had to take part in a struggle for justice and for what I might call spiritual enlightenment in relation to this defining issue of our time. And I think Nelson Mandela and others, Archbishop Tutu as well, understood the linkage between the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa and the Palestinian struggle against this quite different, but still very vicious form of apartheid that has been afflicting the Palestinian people now for such a long time. What has changed, I think, is a certain level of psychopathology in the global sphere, where we find these leaders emerging in many important countries that represent the worst forms of alienation from their own society and from anything beyond that. At a very time when we need a globalist, humanist vision, there is this retreat to hyper-nationalism in so many important societies. It's really posing a terrible threat to the survival of the species in some fundamental ways. And why, under these conditions, do I maintain my commitment to the Palestinian struggle and to these other kind of ecological issues, is partly because we can't know the future. And therefore, there's always the possibility of transcending the present. And we have a responsibility in the face of this uncertainty to struggle for what we believe is right and just and will bring liberation to people that are presently oppressed. And it's from that radical uncertainty, I think, that a certain kind of revolutionary energy and hope and perseverance arise. And I think that explains, as best I can to myself, why, despite age and the temptations of existential retirement, I've resisted those and feel much more alive to the extent that I'm engaged in these struggles.
Thank you, Richard. Your endurance and resilience is really inspiring to all of us. I think that we're getting short on time, so we're going to just skip ahead to take questions from the audience. One of the first ones we have is for Angela, and it comes from Hosama Habayeb. She's a Palestinian novelist who's actually part of the Ghassan Kanafani and James Baldwin panel that we had on Friday. And she asks this, in a letter that Kanafani writes to his son, he says, "Do you believe that man grows? No, he is born suddenly. A word, a moment, penetrates his heart to a new throb. One scene can hurl him down from the ceiling of childhood into the ruggedness of the road." The question is this: if you are to write a letter to a young girl in an Israeli prison, what would you say to her?
Oh, that's a very hard question, because I can't pretend to understand how she might be feeling at this moment, and of course, the time that I myself spent in jail was minimal compared to the suffering and the repression that the million, at least a million Palestinians, between 100,000 and a million, as Hanan pointed out, who've been arrested over the years. But I actually can tell a story, and perhaps I would include this story in the letter to her about my own experience and the fear that I experienced knowing that there was a very good possibility that I would find myself walking that path into the death chamber. I was charged, of course, with 3 capital crimes. And at that time, it was Nixon, it was Reagan, who was the governor of California, it was J. Edgar Hoover. And the possibility of standing up to this force was not really conceivable at the time. And so I did experience an enormous amount of fear about that last walk that I would probably take into the death chamber. And then I began to hear about the organizing that was happening all over the country and all over the world. And I began to realize that I was not alone. I began to feel myself a part of all of the struggles that were unfolding on the other side of the walls. And it occurred to me that even if I ended up taking that last walk to the death chamber, that it would not be, that I would not be alone, that I would be accompanied by all of the people in Palestine and in South Africa and Brazil who were supporting me. And that gave me courage. And I like to point out that Audre Lorde allows us to understand how fear does not have to be an immobilizing force, that we can live through that fear, we can work through that fear, we can mobilize through that fear, we can create community through that fear. So I think I would emphasize the importance of collectivity, the importance of community.
Wow, the chat is blowing up. Thank you. This is another question from the audience, from Hala, and I think this is a very timely political question. How do we confront the new position from Zionists that equates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism? This may be a reference to the IHRA definitions of anti-Semitism that have been now being adopted in places like the UK Labour Party. And also that being anti-Zionist is the same as being anti-Semitic. And as well, the notion for self-determination for Jewish people is a right for Jews as a race, not just a religion, thanks to Trump. Thinking about Trump's attempt to define Jews as a race. This is a very timely question for anyone on this panel who would like to take it up.
Maybe I can start, because I think everybody should have a say in this, since the IHRA definition is relatively new. But attempting to brand anybody who defends the Palestinian cause or who criticizes Israel as an anti-Semite has a long history. It's not new, because since Israel defines itself, or the right wing in Israel, as the voice of all Jews everywhere, they have appropriated the Jewish voice all over the world. And most progressive Jews outside Israel and within Israel do not agree with Israel or with Israeli policies, and do not see that solidarity with Palestine or criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, and they don't want this to be done in their name anyway. So it's a long history, and Netanyahu and all right-wing governments have attempted to use this for 2 specific reasons. First of all, to depict the struggle as a religious struggle, as a struggle between Jews and Muslims, and at the same time to depict Israel as the spokesperson. And by the way, somebody was talking about me as being the spokesperson of the PA and so on. I'm not, but this is later. I can answer that question, Susie. No, that Israel speaks on behalf of all Jews, and as the only Jewish state, defining itself as Richard said, with hyper-nationalism, but it's also ethno-nationalism, and it's also religious nationalism with a messianic approach. And therefore it laid claim to itself, the language of ideology and absolutism and biblical entitlement and exceptionalism and so on, all together, and translated that into political policy. So the IHRA is in the latest expression of this attempt at conflating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, because that's a powerful tool to silence our allies and the people who support the Palestinian cause, and to create fear. And they have succeeded. They have succeeded with governments, but they haven't succeeded with solidarity movements. You asked about what has changed, and I'll tell you, there is a solidarity movement that is powerful and that has broken many taboos, and that is challenging governments everywhere, because governments have demonstrated not just timidity, but in many ways collusion, and their inability to stand up to Israeli violations and exceptionalism, and they're terrified of labels. And therefore they have in many ways withdrawn any kind of accountability from Israel or any kind of protection for Palestine. These are the two things that we always talk about. However, I think in this case, the nation-state law that you talked about is a law that is inherently racist, exclusivist, and exclusionary, that attempts to claim to a group superior rights, whether on the basis of religion or whatever, and at the expense of others. And therefore they have a priori forgiveness for anything they do, because their victims are also already dehumanized, already demonized, already labeled and tucked away as being either terrorists or, well, when they say non-existent, they don't have to face the consequences of their oppression of a non-existent people. But when they label us all as terrorists, then of course they are, they have the full right to oppress, to kill, to imprison, to carry out ethnic cleansing, to build an apartheid system, because we are the victims who deserve their victimhood, and they are the superior people who lay claim to superior treatment and entitlement. And this is, as I said, another phase in a long history. And it started actually early on with the early days of Zionism, and with the attempt to say that there were no people in Palestine, that there are people without a land for a land without a people. So we start with a negation, then we go on with demonization and labeling and so on, and then casting us in many ways outside the discourse of not just political discourse, but social justice and moral commitment. And now, with maybe due to greater knowledge, due to social media, due to greater courage among people who are standing up and speaking out on our behalf, and due to Palestinian resistance and resilience, let's face it, I personally will not malign Palestinians in public. I will talk to my people directly. We will talk to each other directly, but I will not use any public platform to cast doubts on any other Palestinian regardless, because we have to have our own conversation and we have to have our own internal identification. I don't call it solidarity, because we appreciate each other's work. So in a sense, what we must do is to form a common discourse, not just with people who are in solidarity with us, people of conscience, like-minded people, but also among ourselves, and to be able to focus on what's important. And at the same time, to understand that once people acquire knowledge, then they have the tools to break through. Taboos have been broken. Many censorship tools have been defied. And I think this is the greatest change, Susie. that nowadays it's not, I mean, governments like Trump and so on have taken such criminal positions that they need to be held to account. But and all other governments to several degrees. But right now they are being questioned. Right now, Palestine is part of the conversation and part of the public conversation and part of this collectivity, part of the struggle and part of a community of people. It doesn't have to be governments. And that's why it's important to translate this power that we have. And it is a power, to an intrusive power, to a challenging, a power to challenge, and the power to change. And I think we will get there. I agree that the Palestinian people's resilience and the impact they have had, or we have had, let's say, on the rest of the world, and the fact that there are such courageous voices who are taking this on our behalf, not beginning with Mandela. You mentioned Mandela. I just want to talk about two things. When I was in the General Union of Palestine Students, we had a meeting in Amman. I was elected also, and I believe representation, being elected is important, but that's another issue. As a member, a delegate to the GAPS meeting in Amman in '69, the ANC delegation, many delegations from all over the world came. There were Black delegations from the US, the ANC delegation, there were other revolutionary delegations, because we saw each other as being, you know, within the same sphere. And I remember I told you the ANC delegation told us, you must not forget us when you are free. And in 91, I think, 92, I met Mandela in Washington after he was released. And he said, when you speak for all of us. And I said, when you went to prison for all of us. And the ANC told us, you mustn't forget us when you are free. I said, now you mustn't forget us that you are free. And he never did. And he stayed with us, and we had long conversations. We used to see him in Tunis, of course, in secret and so on. But there is an ongoing solidarity. There is an ongoing willingness, and it was not broken. Despite changes in overt political decision-making, people are no longer intimidated in many ways, and there is a sense of involvement and engagement in the active way.
Thank you. Richard or Angela, do you want to take up that question?
Yes, I would really just say a couple of things to reinforce what Hanan just said very eloquently and expressively. We should ask the question, why has this new anti-Semitism definition emerged at this time? And I think it's a recognition of two things. One is that Israel and its supporters no longer really wanted to deal with making an affirmative case. They wanted to discredit their adversaries, their enemies. It wasn't in that dream phase of the early period when the memory of the Holocaust was fresh and there was a sense that Israel controlled the international discourse and made a very glamorous case, which obscured the Nakba and many tragedies. But now they've lost their self-confidence, in my view. And they've lost their self-confidence because the solidarity movements and the resistance, resilience have proved so formidable that their only real effort now, aside from the direct oppression, is to change the conversation. Instead of talking about liberation and Palestinian statehood and Palestinian rights, it's better to talk about the anti-Semitism of the movement that's pushing for these goals. And that's new. It's just similar to what I described by attacking the messenger rather than the message. It's another form of doing that, trying to bring this artificial, really dangerous confusion about the nature of real hatred of Jews, which has nothing to do with the BDS campaign or the support for Palestinian rights. The only other thing I wanted to say was that the origin, in my view, and it's I think in a way uncontroversial, Zionism was always a political project that was somewhat controversial even within Jewish circles. It was not Judaism. It was never something that had the authority of a representation of a religion. And the original sin of Zionism, in my view, was this idea of establishing a Jewish state in a Palestinian society. And once that original sin was committed, everything else followed, including because in a period of decolonization around the world, it had to happen that there would be resistance, and there would be confidence that that resistance could succeed. And the only way to impose this Jewish state was by overwhelming coercion and basically various forms of state terrorism. So that the tragedy of the Palestinian people is really bound up with this effort, that this project to make an exclusivist Jewish state in a indigenous Palestinian society. And that can't happen without a criminal process of oppression.
Thank you. And Dr. Davis, would you like to add?
Well, I'm not unmuted. Yes, I completely agree with what Richard has said. I would only add that it might be important at this moment to encourage popular thinking about the very nature of the nation state. And it seems to me that the struggle in Palestine assists us in that process of questioning the nation state as a product of capitalism, not as the only form of human community that is imaginable. And I say this from an abolitionist perspective, because, of course, as we think about the extent to which abolition has now begun to move into mainstream discourse, none of us could have ever imagined that under the conditions of the pandemic and the awareness of structural racism that emerged, that strategies that all of us had been talking about as residing far into the future. Many of us had said continuously that we don't expect to be able to personally witness the impact of prison abolition, police abolition. But here we are. And that seems to me to point to the power of collective imagination. And so it means that we not only have to recognize the state of Israel and the oppressive strategies of annexing Palestinian territory, but we also have to question the nature of the state more broadly and imagine a period in history where the nation state is no longer the primary form of human community, political human community that we experience. And this is something that I've learned from my involvement in the struggle for a free Palestine, and precisely from the fact that the call for the controversy that has existed for who knows how long between the nature of a Palestinian future, whether it's to reside in a Palestinian state that would exist alongside Israel, or whether it might be something else. And so, certainly the current efforts to criticize anyone who is opposed to the state of Israel as anti-Semitic is absolutely ridiculous, particularly given the role that Israel has played in militarizing the police all over the world, especially here. There are so many reasons why the state of Israel has to be rendered accountable.
Fantastic.
Clap really hard right now. Thank you for that. This whole week being in this festival and surrounded by just Palestinian writers coming together with African American writers and African writers and Indigenous American writers has been so enormously uplifting for me personally, and I'm learning for so many other Palestinians, even who've written to us, even in Palestine. It makes us aware of this. Of how disconnected we are, not just from each other, but from our roots, and it's a real personal wound, and it's a collective wound, and it's an expanding collective wound, and it forms, in my view, this terrain that holds all of us, no matter where we are geographically, linguistically, culturally, economically. We all exist in this common anguish of dislocation and colonization and marginalization and demonization. And I just want to say to all of you that listening to you affects me profoundly, and gives me a great deal of hope. I don't know how much time we have for additional questions. There was one question I kind of wanted to sneak into you, Angela, and it may come off for most of our listeners. But I want to talk about your veganism, what it means to you in the context of liberation, because your struggle for liberation isn't just for humans. It's for a universal, sort of kinder, gentler world. And this festival has adopted as part of its institutional ethos plant-based nutrition. So I wonder if you could briefly speak to that, and then maybe Bill, if you want to choose one of the questions from the audience and before we close.
Thank you for the question, Susan. And let me point out that it's always important to provide context, larger contextual, historical, world historical frameworks for thinking about such issues. I became a vegetarian when I was in jail, and then eventually became a vegan, and with not very much consciousness. But after a while, I recognized how important the struggle for food justice and food sovereignty is throughout the world, particularly given the extent to which the planet is being literally destroyed by industrial capitalist methods of generating profit under the guise of providing nourishment to human beings. And so it's about a sense of connectedness with the flora and fauna of the earth, but it's also about the need to imagine a different way of being in the world, one that does not rest on capitalist profit. And I think that the ways in which animals are treated also mirrors the ways in which human beings are treated, particularly the repressive and oppressive strategies that have been used on Palestinians, on Black people in the US, on the Kurds, apartheid. So yeah, I congratulate you for, I wish I were actually there, then I would be able to enjoy some of the wonderful vegan food, but virtually I have to say congratulations. But that I'm not the kind of vegan who's a proselytizer. I don't assume that all I have to do is travel around the world and encourage people not to eat meat. What I try to do is ask people to eat consciously, to recognize the connectedness between the process of providing nourishment for our bodies with the historical political processes, and specifically with racial capitalism.
Fabulous. There are so many questions in the Q&A, and I'm sorry we don't have time for them all. I'm going to pick one more. A lot of the questions have to do with what I would call political futures for Palestinians, and I'm going to choose one that I think is focused, and maybe we could take up in a few minutes' time, possibly, even though it's a very big question. And the question is from Nancy, who says, do any one of you believe there is a chance for a one-state solution with equal rights for all? It seems like more people on all sides of the Palestinian matter are coming back to the solution. Anyone like to take that up?
I don't think right now in the near future there is any chance of any solution, frankly speaking, because you have to be able to struggle to regain the sense of the ability to have a one state that was advocated in 1968, I think 1969, by the PLO, and was turned down instantly, because when you talk about one state, you talk about, of course, equal rights, you talk about common humanity, you talk about an inclusive system based on human rights and so on. This isn't happening now because Israel is building an apartheid system very clearly and is busy carrying out systematic ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem and in areas around and different places. And Israel is trying to destroy the two-state solution, living side by side, let alone accepting a one-state solution in which it has to relinquish a position of control, of sovereignty, of manipulation, of impunity, the ability to do whatever it wants to Israel, to Palestine. So in a sense, let's go back to literature. Palestinians have two strains in their writing and everything. And they're in your writing, Susie, as well. The impulse to return, the need to return, the need to feel the land, the need to be part of the land. Your poem is just incredible. And at the same time, there is a rebellion against the oppression, a rebellion against captivity, a rebellion against not just captivity in prison, but captivity on the land. Now, how do you accomplish both these things? I think instead of saying one state or two state or whatever, and let's sit and just demand equal rights, I think this is not an agenda that can work right now. What we need to do is have a conversation in which we share, we define our objective as living on our own land. I mean, we can say we don't like nation states, but Palestine was a state for its people. Now there is a state of denial, that either you live in captivity without any rights and in systemic humiliation and total oppression, or you live in exile as a refugee and an exile, and you do not have any rights to return or even to see your own land, as you were denied. So these two have to be resolved. How we resolve them, I think we need a conversation. We need to work out an agenda to resolve the real injustice of being held captive by a military system that deprives you of every right, even the right to breathe on your own, to live in your own home, when they demolish homes, when they kill people. This is happening every day. Who's going to restore life to people who've been killed? Rebuild a house, every time you rebuild it, they destroy it. They give themselves rights to inflict pain in every possible way and to enter your life in every possible way, your home, your school, your street. Nothing is safe. You have no space to breathe, to work, to even produce. And at the same time, those who are in exile, they have the right to understand that they belong. There's a belonging to a people, yes, to a culture, yes, but to a land. How do we reconcile these two? This is something that we have to work out, but we cannot have ready-made answers that either one state or two states. Maybe we can think of other things. Maybe state is not the answer. I don't know. You said no nation state, but until we get to the point where we can live in cyberspace equally and nicely and so on, we have to resolve the issue of the land for Palestine and the issue of identity, vindication of culture, affirmation of rights, and equal rights. That's all we want, whether it's in one state. But if I want to postpone my freedom until Israel kills more people, takes more land, steals more resources, carries out more ethnic cleansing and so on, then I think I will have to justify this to the people who are suffering, who are victims of this situation. I would like to see a solution. I don't care what you call it, a solution to exile and expulsion and dispossession and captivity and oppression and total negation. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard or Angela, would you like to try?
You're muted, Richard. You're muted. You're on mute.
Richard, unmute yourself, please.
I was dealing with a cat on my lap, which complicated life. I really wanted to say essentially that the future of Palestine should be determined by the Palestinian people. One thing that those of us who act in solidarity should have learned is that the outside world cannot solve the problems of self-determination. That is the most sacred right of a people, especially in this era of decolonization or post-colonial politics and ethics. The UN made a horrible mistake in 1947 when they attempted to impose, without consenting the people that lived in Palestine, a partition of an existing community. And the whole idea of figuring out what is best for another people or peoples in this case is something that we should have a great deal of humility in relation to. And one thing that Americans lack is humility. especially geopolitical humility. And my own view is that when the struggle of the Palestinian reaches the point which South Africa reached at one stage, at that point, a solution will emerge out of the process of liberation, that it can't be blueprinted in advance. It has to come from those that carry the torches of liberation. And hopefully that won't be in such a distant future.
You're muted.
Thank you, Richard. Would you like the last word on this, Dr. Davis?
No, I think that we've heard the best possible responses to that question. I'll only say that self-determination is a concept that those of us who've been involved politically for a long time are very familiar with. So why is it so difficult to talk about the self-determination of the Palestinian people?
Brilliant, thank you.
When we set this up, we were worried about Zionist trolls attacking us. There's a couple of.
We can't hear you, Susan.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Better.
A little better.
Oh, sorry, I don't know what's going on. I was saying that when we set this up, we were worried about Zionist trolls sort of coming in and disrupting and things. And we haven't had actually that issue, but I don't want to ignore some of there's a little bit of trolling from our own here. And, you know, I don't think this is really the place for it, but I do feel a need to kind of step in here a little bit, because I wanted to say that number one, Hanan is not a spokesperson for the PA, nor has she been a spokesperson for collaboration or anything of the sort. I know that she has always been transparent about her role. She doesn't need me to defend her, and honestly, I kind of debated whether or not to kind of dignify these sort of, you know, statements in the guise of questions in the Q&A. But Hanan, I don't want to ask you to defend yourself, but if there's anything you want to say, I want to allow you an opportunity to say that. But if you don't feel like you need to dignify it, I think that's perfectly fine as well.
I think people know better. People who want to know my history, know my role, know my struggle. Those who know, you know, what I've done, do not, you know, associate me, or do not just send out these accusations without knowing. But I was a spokesperson for the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid peace process, yes, and to Washington, because we were a people's delegation. We were a delegation that didn't have political office, and we went to defend our people and to speak out. When there were secret talks and they signed the DOP and so on, we stepped out. I stepped out myself, and I never accepted the role of an appointed spokesperson. I never justify anything I don't agree with, and I'm not an apologist for anything I disagree with. So to me, I've focused all my life, and I really don't want to defend myself because I don't see anything to defend. I'm just trying to explain that ignorance does not help, and that not knowing all the facts and just brandishing accusations and so on. And it's strange to hear it from Palestinians who know that if you focus on the struggle and Palestinian rights, this is where you can't go wrong. But I don't want to be sidetracked, and I don't want to start talking about maligning each other. I don't think it serves any purpose.
And I also think it, you know, it has to do with being a woman, and I think we see this quite a lot. But
That's true. But being one of the few women in position of authority, and you know how I got to the PLO, it in many ways makes you a legitimate target to many people. And Look, I was attacked for many reasons. Israelis attacked me, Zionists attacked me, even Arabs from the Gulf attacked me. They attacked me on ageism. You're still alive, they say. They attack me as a woman. Why do you have your hair like this, or why don't you go home? And they attack me for my identity, or they attack me for my politics. But as I said, Palestinians have to have their own conversation.
Absolutely.
And we mustn't fall into the trap, yes, of negating each other. Thank you.
I hope I didn't make a mistake in bringing that up, but it's bothersome because I know you and I know better, and I know your integrity, and I know what you're about, and it's painful to see these, but I didn't want to ignore it, because when these things kind of go out there, it sounds like you guys can't hear me again, right?
It's better.
Okay, but I hope you heard my last comment.
Sure.
We're going to try and we're over time, so we're going to try and wrap things up now. One of the things that we wanted to do is to bring out our the whole team. So everybody on this team, if you can turn your cameras on. This has been an enormous labor of love for 2 years. And we were stifled by a multitude of issues, pandemic being one of them, of course. So here is Dawood, our tech guy. Ahmed and Jacqueline are here in my house. We have interpreters. We have Lama Amr in Ramallah, Andrew Ross, Ala Ghaith, Susan Maadi Darraj, Noor Ghannam, Adam Yashiro, Malini, Johar Schuler, Noor Ghannam, Zaha Hassan, Anas Herzallah in Gaza, David Pulimbolu, Siraj Isa, Ayel Fahmawi, all of you, Nina Bina in Florida. This was a huge collective effort. We all did it as a labor of love. We want to continue this festival going forward. We want to thank everybody who has been a part of this. We want to thank all of our funders. This festival had over 3,000 registrants from 75 different countries tuning in all week long. We're very proud of that, and we can't be. I can't thank everybody enough. We're still digesting what this whole festival of being together has meant, and then with the culmination of this incredible keynote panel, just really fills my heart, and I know it does for so many other people. Everybody who registered is going to get follow-up emails from us. And as I said in the opening remarks, when you all entered the venue, you saw that the virtual building was located in Jerusalem. So we returned to Jerusalem in this virtual space, and because the justice we want and the justice we need has to start in our ability to imagine it as individuals and as collectives. So as we send our wonderful panelists off, I just want to say, may we meet physically next year in Palestine, in Jerusalem, in Nazareth, in Haifa, Akka, Yafa, Majda, Al-Ariha, and all of the cities and towns and the villages to which we belong and to which we long for, and which live inside of us now. So I know that you're all clapping hugely now for our team and for our wonderful panelists. Thank you from the bottom of our heart. If anybody wants to stay and hang out with us, we're going to have a hangout after our panelists leave. You're welcome to do so. Thank you, Hanan. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Angela. You are wonderful, and we love you. You inspire us. You nourish our hearts. You nourish our souls. And yeah, that's clapping. Thank you.
Thank you all.